Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to IAP2's learning webinar, Our Community Could Blow Up. Do we have time for some quick consultation? It is with absolute pleasure that I welcome all of you here today on behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia. It's a real pleasure to having you joining us. And in a few minutes, I'm going to introduce Kristi and Doug. But for now, Drew, let's hand it over to you for a little bit of housekeeping.
Right. Well, this is a very interactive webinar, so we're going to encourage you to take part. They've got a great presentation coming up, but there's an opportunity for you to ask questions, make comments, and as you may have seen on the screens going by, there's a few ways you can do that. First of all, your microphones. Please leave your microphones unmuted. We'll control all of that here and mute everybody and then unmute people as they want to ask a question. If you want to do it verbally, you can click the little yellow hand icon up on your control panel there, and that'll indicate that you want us to come to you, and we will do so when it's appropriate. Or if you're the shy, retiring type, or for some reason your audio is just not working, pop it into the question box. And when it's appropriate, Amelia will break in and ask your question or add your comment to the mix. So do please take part in that. We've also got polls coming up, so please take part in the poll surveys as well. It's a good way for us to just get into the feel of being a participation kind of presentation. This is being recorded, and we'll send you the link. It's for your professional development, of course, and we'll send you the link to the recording once it's been put up onto our YouTube sites. We'll also be sending you along some links to some other interesting collateral things coming along, and we'll also send you a link after the webinar is finished to a survey that we do. It's kind of an exit survey. It gives us an opportunity to see what you liked about this webinar, what you would like to see for future webinars, some ideas. We can keep on improving these as they go along. So with that, that's about it for now. I'm going to hand this back to Amelia to get this party started.
Thank you so much, Drew. And it's with real pleasure today that I get to introduce Kristi and Doug. Kristi Parker Celico is with Rocky Mountain Collaborative Solutions, and Kristi brings over 20 years experience in multi-party facilitation, mediation, coaching, and public engagement expertise, focusing on environmental concerns at the local and national levels. A graduate of Colorado College with her master's from Harvard, Kristi specializes in addressing highly scientific and contentious topics, assisting stakeholders in marrying the best of the scientific knowledge with the reality of the politics and the concerns of those most likely to be affected by the policy. Kristi formerly led the Keystone Center, but works as a sole proprietor. She has also worked as an economist for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Exxon, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. So a very big welcome to Kristi. Now I get to introduce Doug Sarno. Doug has over 30 years experience in a wide range of disciplines that support public participation and participatory decision-making. He is recognized throughout the world as an expert in public participation, outreach, and education, and regularly convenes diverse groups to discuss controversial subjects, make consensus recommendations, and establish effective teams. He has managed and facilitated thousands of public meetings, dozens of long-term stakeholder advisory boards, and designed and facilitated many national and international stakeholder forums. Doug is also a trainer and a master certified IAP2 P2 professional. So it's a real pleasure that I get to welcome both Kristi and Doug. They are going to be presenting over the next 40 to 45 minutes. Then we're going to be opening it up for questions and answers. But in the interim, if you've got any if you've got any clarification questions that you need to ask, please, as Drew said, just pop them in the question box and I will break in and we'll ask those clarification questions. So with that, Kristi and Doug, I am handing it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Amelia. This is Kristi, and I'll begin talking a little bit about the situation that we found ourselves in. The situation we had was frankly fairly unique, but hopefully we can draw some lessons today, because I suspect many of you have run into situations that had some similarities in terms of limited time to provide public input, a very explosive situation where, frankly, the public's explosive, but also there was a real risk of public danger. And frankly, every morning, Doug and I would get up, and the first thing we'd do is pull up the Shreveport, Louisiana newspaper to see if anything had happened overnight that we needed to be aware of. There were a number of environmental justice issues that came to bear on this issue. And finally, we were told that technology really probably wasn't a solution in this kind of quieter, smaller community. And that turned out not to be quite true. So hopefully with those kind of things, we'll give a summary of the situation, but then we'll draw some process lessons that'll be helpful to everybody, and look forward to your input. So to begin with, take yourself back to October 2012 in Minden, Louisiana, a not very large town, where there was a very large explosion in the middle of the night. There was a 7,000-foot mushroom cloud. Houses were knocked off their foundations. A lot of things happened. And you can see on the right-hand side, immediately people were in full speculation as to what actually happened. And it ranged from, was that a fracking explosion? Did we have a meteor? Aliens? It really ranged the full gamut of issues. What it turned out to be was a storage bunker that was based at Camp Minden National Guard Base in Minden, Louisiana. Oops, sorry. Don't know why that did that. There we are. That really, as you can see, it exploded with a bit of a bang. Sorry, bad pun. So how did we get here? What were the risks going forward? Who's responsible? All those issues were really a huge crisis at this time. Doug, I'll hand it to you then.
So this whole story starts in March of 2010 when a small company called Explo Systems, Louisiana company, gets a $3 million a year contract from the U.S. Army to recycle millions of pounds of gun propellant. It's a propellant called M6 in Army parlance, and they think they can take this explosive material and turn it into coal mining, dynamite, and other kinds of explosives to help with coal mining and other kind of mining operations. So they lease space at Camp Minden because Camp Minden just happens to have all of these bunkers that are largely empty, and they think, oh, well, great, we'll get paid by the Army, take this stuff, we'll store it at Camp Minden, and then we'll sell it to the coal industry and make even more money. Next slide. So Camp Minden is, as Kristi pointed out, it's in a tiny little town of Minden, Louisiana, not too far from Shreveport. Shreveport's a reasonable sized city. Minden only has a population of about 13,000 people, and the closest little town to Camp Minden is actually Doyline, which has a population of about 1,000 people. So it's pretty sparsely populated. Next. Now, M6 propellant is not like a little bit of gunpowder you put into to a shotgun. It is a massive amount of explosive capacity, and it's used to send large projectiles very long distances, like in this M6 tank. So this is material with a lot of explosive capacity. Go ahead, Kristi. So over the course of 2 years, the Army shipped 16 million pounds of this stuff to Camp Minden. This is the reason the Army is getting rid of it is because it's old. It no longer can be safely used in these large guns. It's actually degrading and quite unstable. And in order to keep it from blowing up, it's got to be kept dry and cool and be stored in bomb-safe storage buildings in a certain configuration to keep it as safe as possible. After it had been there for a few years and hadn't gone anywhere, the Army Explosive Safety Board did a study and said, hey, guys, something really needs to happen with this stuff soon, because we're thinking there are risks of self-ignition by August of 2015. In other words, if something doesn't happen, an explosion can happen at any time. And as you saw, it actually did happen. Next. So this was Explo's approach to the requirement to store this stuff in a dry, cool, safe storage building. They literally just took the cardboard boxes that were full of this stuff, that the Army sent and stored them outside. Next. As it turned out, as they started to receive this material, the market for using explosives in coal mining all but disappeared. There was no market for this. There was no one to buy this material. They had nothing to do with it. And so they basically did nothing. Even worse, as they were doing nothing and still receiving more and more of the material, and being paid by the U.S. government to receive this material, they never complied with their contract. They did not put it into a safe orientation. They didn't move it on time. They didn't treat it like it was supposed to be treated. They didn't transport it in the time frame their contract told them they had to. They didn't provide sufficient space or safe space, or even space in the buildings that they were supposed to be putting these in. And they did almost no record keeping. By August 2013, with no market and having done nothing, and I think they did pay rent to Camp Minden for a little while, they filed for bankruptcy. And as it turns out, Explo Systems wasn't really a company at all. It was just two guys who were related to another guy who happened to give out contracts in the Louisiana government. And these two guys, next slide, ended up in jail. In fact, 6 Explo employees and these 2 owners were charged with a number of federal crimes, including lying to get the contracts, storing the M6 unsafely, as we showed, and obstructing any level of government inspections of the materials or the spaces that they were using to store it. So for 2 years after Explo went under and these guys ended up being charged with crimes, federal and state agencies began to argue over who's responsible. Remember, they're already saying it's unstable, it's degrading, it needs to be taken care of. And so for 2 years, a number of federal and state agencies are arguing over this. In the end, it really was EPA and the National Guard who got stuck with this problem. The Army really wanted nothing to do with it. They said, they engaged in a legal and enforceable contract to get rid of this material. It was no longer their problem. But here, this community now had 15 million pounds of this stuff, and no one to pay for the cleanup. Next. So in October of 2014, faced with an impending emergency and a real problem, the EPA and the Army and the state of Louisiana entered into an agreement and announced that they would do an open burn, which these are, what you're looking at here are what they call burn tables. And this is actually a fairly common practice. This is what the Army would have done with this stuff had they not sent it to Explo, is basically just burn it in the open and get rid of it. And they came to this approach. That's a common approach. In fact, that is the most common approach to getting rid of this stuff. And they came to this conclusion and this decision without any public input at all. And you're all in this business, so you know that's also a fairly common approach. So, Kristi, I think you can take it from here.
Yeah, so the next day there was another type of explosion. So basically after 2 years of the Army being worried that this stuff was going to explode, they then announced that they were going to open burn it, and then the public really just opened up. And so from the pictures you can see there were protests, there were all sorts of people that really demonstrated. They ended up with 8,500 people on a Facebook page that were very vocal and raging. They also ended up with 75 national groups that all signed a common letter sent to the EPA to say, do not open burn this, that's ridiculous. And then it had some Louisiana style to it also. So in the upper left-hand corner, you'll note they did a really brilliant music video, and we'll send that along with the IAP PowerPoint so you can see a copy of that. It was really quite clever and talented. The woman in the red sweater, who looked about 12, was actually a swim instructor from the community and a gay activist. and turned out to be one of the fiercest activists I've ever met. She was in her mid-20s and was really very powerful and led much of the community issues. The woman, the blonde in the mug shot at the bottom, was interesting enough an activist from California that leads an international group on anti-incineration. So this community was fighting don't do open burn. This woman's fighting the next step of, oh, don't build an incinerator, which some people would consider certainly a step up from open burn in terms of safety. She was making sure and pushing that didn't happen either. You'll see the article from the New York Times there. Charles Blow, who's a regular writer on the op-ed page, happened to be from a town right nearby and was very active, posting stories, as was Rachel Maddow and others. So this really got a lot of national attention. And finally, the gentleman getting out of his truck, Sam Mims, was really a key player in this. Mr. Mims would often start by saying, well, it's just me and my 2 cows that have an opinion here, and the but was, frankly, he'd been a colonel in the military. So every time somebody would say, oh, we can't do that, the Army can't do that, he'd say, yeah, you can. I've been around long enough that maybe you could do something different here. The second thing about Colonel Mims, though, was after he retired, he became a minister. And he had a beautiful, deep, gravelly voice and so charismatic and a fairly large flock. And he made it very clear that the Army thought they were going to open burn any of this, he was going to bring he and his congregation to make sure that didn't happen by laying down in front of any bulldozers or effort. So it really was a very contentious situation. So on January 15th, EPA came forth and said, okay, we know we took 90 days, or we took 2 years, to decide that we were going to open burn it. But now we're going to give you 90 days to think about other technologies that might be out there and to hear if there's any community input and ideas. And so at that point, I got a call. And the community had heard about my work through a dialogue I had done on chemical weapons destruction that had some similarities. And they really wanted to do something like that. That was a 3-year effort that had been a national, international effort and had taken a lot of time and money and a big team, frankly. And we now have 45 days. So it was really quite shocking. So I did what anybody would do, and I called my colleagues that had been involved in the chemical weapons effort and asked if they wanted to help out and pitch a team. And they all immediately said, no, that's insane. So I had been given Doug's name through the grapevine, knew he was a great facilitator, and most importantly, also knew he was an engineer that could come up to speed very quickly on some very technical issues. And I said, I have a real deal for you. It's an interesting project. They need us. It's in Louisiana. I might have forgotten to mention exactly what part of Louisiana it was in, but that was later discovered, I suppose, by Doug. So now we're faced with a fairly impossible task. We have 5 agencies that are involved that are all denying that the M6 is theirs and that they have any responsibility for it. Not going to pay for it, not going to do anything other than open burn, which, by the way, they wouldn't even agree that they'd all agreed to open burn it. There's a document with all their names on it. The community was extremely angry, and the community all wanted an advisory board. Much of the community did. But many of the agencies opposed having an advisory board, primarily due to a federal U.S. law called FACA, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We have one facilitator, myself, in Boulder, Colorado, one facilitator, Doug, in Washington, D.C., neither of us within 1,000 miles of the site, and we're now at 45 days for being able to provide and get any kind of public input. So and of course, at every point, the Army is saying this could explode at any time. And we'd seen that it exploded, so that was clear. But we are also a little questioning about, was their push on it could explode at any time because they really wanted to push open burn as a technology. And that clearly was the quickest, cheapest thing they could do. So it's hard to know how much that was a bluff and how much that was a real concern. And certainly when you see those pictures of all the stuff sitting around, it seemed pretty real. So, as I said, FACA is a U.S. law that's called the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And it basically says if you're going to get consensus advice of any sort, you have to have a federal charter. So it's kind of a sunshine law saying, make sure there's a diversity of people on the group and that meetings are open to the public and all those things. So it's encouraging transparency. However, I have kind of fear because it's a bureaucratic hassle. Frankly, you usually can't even get a FACA committee up and running short of 8 months. It takes a White House sign-off. It is a big ordeal. And there was no way we knew we'd get through the paperwork of that. So we had a real problem there. So challenge number 1, what do you guys do? Do you even take the job? If you do, what do you contemplate doing in 45 days? What kind of process might you use? So here, and don't worry, but things could explode at any point, so take your time. So here is the first challenge, which I'll hand to Drew. I think there's a way to do a poll. And as a reminder, the open burn really is best practice. U.S. military does this all over the world to get rid of things. However, I will remind you also that this would have been by far the largest open burn ever conducted in history. You could hold an open house to inform and get input from people. Establish an online forum. That could be a challenge given you're in a place where we're just told technology may not work as well. You could establish an advisory board, but you've got a Federal Advisory Committee Act problem. Or you could do what most of us really want to do sometimes at night is to go, tell EPA, good luck, call me when that's solved. So we'll ask for folks to go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Kristi. So the poll question is up right now. So I love the way that you're talking about all of these wonderful options that you have available to you. So everyone that's on the call right now, please check one of those options that you'd like to pursue. Drew, I think people have probably had enough time now to mark one of those options. So if you want to close it, and let's see what people have to say. All right. So Kristi, 11% said they'd help EPA communicate. 70% said they'd hold an open house to inform and get input from the community. Nobody established an online forum. 11% indicated that they'd establish an advisory board. And I love the fact that 7% said, hey, APA, good luck on this. So there you go. There's the responses from your participants on the call today.
Doug adds his vote to the good luck as well.
So obviously we took the job. Doug and I felt like I had the process background from the chemical weapons situation. Doug had the engineering background. And frankly, it was a tough situation. EPA didn't have time to come up with an option and work. So we had to figure it out. And we both jumped on board. And essentially we ended up building kind of what was a non-FACA advisory board that could give a consensus input, but without calling it consensus input from the group. And we'll get into a little bit more of the detail of that in a minute. We finished in 30 days. That was frankly all the time we had. So in that time, we did 3 in-person meetings of the advisory group, the dialogue. We did 6 webinars for the technical piece. I'll come back to that. For the full group, and then 6 just for the technical subgroup. And then we did a final big public workshop and meeting. And all of our meetings and calls were open to the public. We took public comment at every point and kind of engaged the full range of folks because we thought we had to be transparent as given the great risk to everybody on this. So I'm going to go through some specific ideas that we thought worked, and I'm sure you all could have come up with many other ideas that probably worked better, but, we were running hard. The first thing I'd say is usually when I'd start some kind of situation like this where the community didn't know either of us, there was a lot of anger, our facilitation style would have been pretty light, and we would have spent some time building consensus over ground rules and other things. There was really no time for that. So we really had to do what we called strong arm facilitation with the idea that the minute we got pushed back, we were going to recalculate and switch directions. And so the people could see we are making strong decisions, but if we're going the wrong way, push us and we'll go a different way. And so at every point, we were driving really hard. So the first thing we did was we could not get any of the agencies to step up and summarize what was the situation? How many millions of pounds of this M6 are out there? Is it stable? What are the legal implications? Who's legally responsible? Who has technical knowledge on this? So frankly, Doug and I interviewed everybody as quickly as we could, and we put together a starting PowerPoint of here's what we think the facts are, here's what the situation was. And we got through it pretty decently. We had a little pushback on things, but we kind of wove that thread as, carefully as you can regarding ownership and the particular issues to set the tone to get us launched. The second thing is we did not do any collaborative ground rule thing. We proposed the ground rules and said if you're dying over something, let us know, but otherwise we got to keep moving. What was important to clarify is that the government by law has to make a decision of what to do with this stuff. That can't be handed over to the public. You can't say, send it to Florida. But that they did have a mandate for public input. So we walked that line very carefully. And finally, the other thing on ground rules that we used is a ground rule I've often used that I think is successful. People sometimes think I'm a little crazy, but it's called the no surprises rule, which means that you cannot, as a participant in this effort, file a lawsuit, write a letter to the editor, go to your congressman, go up the chain of command, et cetera, without telling the advisory group what you're doing. And you give them 24 hours to come back and comment to you. That doesn't mean you still can't file your lawsuit or your newspaper article or whatever, but it gives you 24 hours to have the other side say, if you do this, let me tell you what I'm going to do. We really felt like we did not have any time for the process to get blown out of the water for a couple of days when somebody did something goofy and then you have to recover from it. So we instituted the no surprises rule, and people were really good about it, and it worked successfully, I think, to keep us on track. Finally, we proposed the full process, kind of based on what we had done in chemical weapons destruction a few years ago. We're going to set some broad criteria for how to destroy this technology. So it's got to be environmentally safe. It has to actually destroy this stuff so it's not dangerous. It has to protect the community. It has to be within cost. I mean, we have specific details for all those. We're going to evaluate the technologies then against the criteria, and we're going to provide a recommendation. So it was a very clear process that we set out. A second thing that we struggled with and we ended up thinking worked was, as I said, none of the agencies would take responsibility or provide any leadership. It wasn't clear who owned the stuff, who would pay for it, and they really just viewed us as facilitators. And so they didn't want, we hadn't been hired to help the government figure out what to do. We'd been hired to figure out this, quote, public problem. And so what we did was we started to hold meetings just with the agencies under the guise of, well, we need to set the agenda for the public meeting. We just want to kind of make sure everybody's on board. This really helped develop relationships between the agencies, but more importantly, it also helped us ask questions like, so when the public says, who's going to pay for this? What are you guys going to answer? Are you all going to look at each other in a public meeting and not respond? Let's hash that out now. And so we really were able to kind of establish some leadership and some answers prior, because frankly, they needed more facilitation than the public did. They were a mess. We had been told this was a really poor community. People aren't online. It's not going to work. Increasingly, Doug and I found, and I'm sure many of you have too, that that's just really not true almost in any community. I've worked on very remote islands and in places, tribal communities where they say no one's online. And typically they are. And in this case in Louisiana, what was interesting is it also kind of gave the community a little bit of practicing things together. So people helped each other get online. The NGOs, the local government, different folks helped people get online and so they could communicate. Finally, on technology, for those of you that work with U.S. governments, we are often told, oh, no, we couldn't dare post that on our website within a 2-month period. It'll take forever to get this or that. We found, and we were working with senior levels of government, but they can be agile. And we were often handing them documents that were 10 minutes before a webinar started and that they would have it posted on the EPA webinar website, the major website, within 10 minutes. So our lesson there was to go ahead and push because they probably can do it. You just have to ask the right person. Finally, I said early on that they had a Facebook page of 8,500 people. And normally we don't participate in that kind of group, but frankly, to keep the rumors from flying and to keep folks knowing when public meetings are, et cetera, we ended up actively participating on the community Facebook page. It was also a great way, frankly, to hear about what all the concerns were. So by the time people got to public meetings, we were fairly clear what the issues were going to be. So Doug, I'll hand it to you regarding challenge number 2.
Right. The challenge of identifying technology was really at the core of what we were there to do. In other words, the community said no open burn. Ultimately, EPA said, okay, no open burn, but you have 90 days to pick an alternative. And we need to squeeze a public participation process within that. And we realized that in order for the community to meaningfully participate in this process, they had to get smart. They didn't really have the expertise or the capacity to weigh in on an alternative technology in any feasible way. Next slide. So this actually resulted in a number of challenges. First of all, obviously, it's a highly technical topic, but that was not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge was everybody believed they knew things that they didn't actually know. Community leaders, a lot of them, or the activists, were convinced by outside groups that some technologies are the ones they had to push for. These sort of wish list technologies that were out there in this broader. There was a whole activist community surrounding this issue with the Army, and they were pushing for a very specific set of technologies. But these technologies just were not ready. They were not ready for any massive task, certainly not one that had to be done quickly and in such quantity as the one we were facing. The community also had their preference about the range of technologies and the environmental cleanliness of those technologies, and again, those just weren't able to do the job. And then you also had the industry and companies, technology vendors in the mix, all trying to sell something to this community in a very convincing way, and some of those claims were less than truthful. And so you just had all of these people lining up. People were deciding which technologies should work based on very little information, very little fact, and sometimes just outright lies. And it turns out the Army is the only group who truly understands this problem, truly understands these materials, truly understands the technologies and the status of technologies that are involved. And they just steadfastly refused to send anyone to help. They sent a PR person, but they would not send a technical rep. And EPA had some expertise, but they were very slow to help. Not out of unwillingness, but just trying to get out of their own way to pull together their technical folks and help us. And we literally had a month to work on this. And also, things could blow up at any moment, so we were pushing. The community had experts, but not really in this field. They believed they did, but they really didn't agree on anything, and they just kind of muddied the waters. We also had some outside experts, but they were from other parts of the state. They were of varying technical quality. Some of them were very, very good, but it took a while for them to be believable and to be trusted by the community. And of course, we were just running out of time. So in the end, we basically, go ahead. We basically decided we were going to stop asking for permission, because if we waited for help, it was not coming. As I said, here's the total picture of everyone at DoD that was willing to help. Next slide. Here's the information we got from EPA that was on time that we could use. Next slide. This is what Louisiana could have brought to the table, and we actually were looking forward to some of this, but we didn't get it. We did get really good food. We had these wonderful volunteers that catered all of our big public meetings from the community on their own dime. It was fabulous. Man, they fed just us all day long, because these were day-long meetings, and it was just one of the nicest community kind of collaborations I've ever been a part of. Next slide. Here's what Louisiana actually brought to the table. Again, matching their other agency counterparts. We had in the kickoff call, there were a couple of different agencies from Louisiana that were there, and then we never heard from them again. It was radio silence. It was actually pretty frustrating. Next slide. So we really had to figure out, how do we do this? How do we get this stakeholder group up and running? How do we get it the information it needs? How do we do a reasonable evaluation of available technologies, and we had a few weeks essentially to do this. And seriously, things could blow up at any time. This stuff was not stable. The one contribution the Army gave us at every turn was, this stuff is not stable. And we said, great, help us figure out what to do. Well, we can't do that. Next slide. So what would you do, right? So we have to get this whole community and this advisory board smart about this this technology. We bounced around a couple of different ideas. One was just do a technology open house for all the different technology vendors and allow them to explain their solutions and explain their technologies. Hire a technical advisor, one person that the community really trusts that can kind of spearhead this, corral this technology selection, or go to some online poll and just let everybody weigh in and see what rises to the top, or any other ideas. So our next poll is for you to weigh in on that.
Thanks very much. So the next poll is up there. So the questions are, so what would you do? Open house, identify a technical advisor, hold online poll, or other? And if you're putting other, please put the other in the question box. So Drew, we're just going to give people maybe another couple of seconds to think about what they would do. And here's the results. So open house. So 26% of your webinar participants, Doug and Kristi, are saying maybe an open house with the tax. 68% are saying identify a technical advisor that the community trusts. Nobody wants to hold an online poll. And other, let me just see what we've got in other, just a second here. All of the above. So that's,
there you go.
So that's what we're getting. Back to you guys. Thank you.
All of the above is a good choice, actually. We did a little bit of all of the above. What we found was we really just didn't have time to identify and vet a technical advisor that everybody would trust. You can imagine there was a trust deficit in this community at this point. So essentially, I stepped into that role, for lack of a better term. I really became more of the manager of the technology process as opposed to the substantive expert. Seemed to work, and so we basically managed everything. And this was the theme of this whole thing. Kristi said, we kicked this all off by giving a presentation on the background. We were the least qualified people to give the presentation on this background, but nobody else would pull it together, and certainly not in time. And so we basically interviewed everyone, ransacked every place we could possibly go to find information, and we put the thing together ourselves. And that's what we did for this technology choice as well. We worked directly with the community advisory board, and we put together a technical advisory subgroup, and we together facilitated them developing their criteria. What did the technology need to achieve? And that was everything from the technical requirements that were handed down from the Army and the National Guard to the community's requirements around cleanliness and environmental issues and those sorts of things. And then we actually served as, because we were trying to figure out how do we get this information. We talked to some vendors, and we realized the only thing we could possibly do was put out a global call for vendors and ask everyone who had any kind of technology or who had expressed any interest in this project or had said they had a technology or we knew of that had a technology, and it was an open call, so people we'd never even heard of could weigh in as well. We basically said, we're going to, there's this big project, it's worth a lot of money for the winner. This is a non-binding call for vendors, but it will greatly influence the final outcome. And I think we gave people a few days to respond, and we gave them very specific questions to answer, and we gave them worksheets for them to fill out. So we had a very consistent kind of evaluation process that we used. And then we used an open webinar tool that we used throughout this process, where the dialogue members could actually converse and ask questions. Kristi and I, when we use this tool, one of us would facilitate the tool and the other one would take notes, and we took the notes live on the tool so that people could see the notes we were taking, and those notes would get posted real time to the platform that we were using for this process. Anyone could dial in either by phone or by web and listen to what was going on, but only the dialogue members themselves could participate in the question and answer and ask questions of the process as it was going on. Everything was voice recorded as well as the notes. Everything was instantly posted to the web. And then at the end of every one of these, we allowed the public to weigh in with questions as well. Next. So establishing the objective technical criteria was really important. As I said, the full group was involved in this. It was very broad. It was very community-based. It was very easy to understand. The restrictions and the constraints on the material and the regulatory and legal constraints were also built into that. So everybody understood exactly what any technology had to achieve, and there was really no wiggle room for that. There just time and throughput were a big issue, as you can imagine. There was a lot of material that had to be treated in a fairly short period of time. Next. So we did this global call for vendors, as I said, and it happened over the course of about a week. We sent out this call to 26 known technology vendors. We had these very specific questions. We ended up getting, 5 days later, about 10 responses. And these 10 responses, probably 8 of them really took it seriously and gave us the detailed answers to the questions that we asked. And literally the very next day, we organized all that information. The very next day, we ran, each vendor had an hour to present to the public their tool, their technology through our webinar tool. And so we put a schedule together. A lot of people made every single one of these. If they didn't make them live, they could always go in and watch them in the archive online. And we collected all the information and we compared it to the criteria that this group put together and put everything into a master table of what each technology could do. And it became very clear pretty much instantly that there were only a few technologies that were available, that were proven, and that could meet the criteria. And by doing this and by engaging the public in this process, it was not hard then for them to come to the conclusion that their pet technologies, that the things that they were carrying forward, that the carrying the water for those national stakeholder groups or for the vendors that they were friends with or others, it became pretty obvious. And even the technology vendors themselves had to admit, no, they really could not come close to warranting or suggesting that their technology was up to the task. So most technologies fell off pretty quick. Go ahead. So with that, it became pretty quick and pretty obvious. The handful, it wasn't even a handful, there was a couple of technologies that were available. The technical work group spent a good amount of time on the phone and in person talking about that, and we came to community consensus within a few days on a contained burn technology. It was available. It could be built in time. It could have the environmental controls built onto it that met the community's concerns, and it could handle the throughput that this massive throughput that we needed to do for this project. So we had community consensus. The irony was we weren't allowed to say so, right? Because it wasn't a FACA approved advisory board, and so we could not actually produce a community consensus document that said, hey, we're all in agreement and this is where we are. So the tool we chose instead was that Kristi and I wrote what we called a facilitators report, which basically was the outcomes of this process. And in that, we identified what we called a sense of the group as to where they are and where they arrived. And we also then so we wrote that report, we summarized everything, and then we allowed individual members of the advisory group to add their detailed comments or thoughts or ideas or statements at the end. And so it did include their direct voice as well. And it was well received. I mean, I think everyone pretty much realized that this was as good as we were going to do, and under the circumstances, it was practically a miracle. The community continued to have a concern about now we had to move into a very fast RFP process. We had to go through government procurement to actually bring a technology vendor on board, and the community was concerned about that, and they wanted to make sure that the community voice was continued to be heard throughout that process. And they had asked this before, and they asked again if there could be actually a community member or two on that review panel, the official review panel for that RFP process. And at first, the government balked at that, and they pushed back and said, no, that's not possible. But in the end, it was indeed possible, and they did it. They had two of our members, both highly qualified people, to sit on that ultimate review panel and made the selection.
So the good news is that EPA then approved the contain burn situation as the new technology. So within their window of period, they approved it being built. It was a $35 million facility. They got it up. They got it testing. They began burning the M6 by October, and by 6 months later, they had burned all of the M6. And frankly, Doug and I then stopped getting up every morning and looking at the darn newspaper in Shreveport, Louisiana, to make sure nothing was exploding. The community really, everybody breathed a deep sigh of relief, and we felt like a huge mission had been accomplished. There's a whole postscript to this that we won't spend any time on, but then this is a fairly poor community, and some folks went, boy, we have the fanciest, quote, contained burn system in the world. People should send us their waste from all over the world, and we'll get rid of it. And as you might imagine, half the community said, oh, no, we don't want to become a dumping ground for everybody else's stuff. And so then there became a huge argument about who owns the burn chamber, who controls it, can we burn stuff there in the future? That process is just coming to an end now, and I suspect in the next week we'll see an announcement that the chamber is being sold, and it is being sold to someone out of state. And Doug, I'll let you take the last one here.
And so we learned a few lessons. It was funny when Kristi and I sat down to do our paper for the IAP2 conference last fall. We pulled out our old notes, and I was looking at the timeline, and we got on the phone, and I said, Kristi, do you realize we did all of that work in 30 days? And she laughed and said, no. And I said, we really did. And I mean, I think even we, looking back, didn't believe it. Didn't believe we were able to pack that in 30 days. It felt like a year and a half, but it was 30 days. I don't think either of us got a whole lot of sleep. But you know, one of the things we do our public participation training, and one of the things we always tell people is, you know, you don't really do public participation in an emergency. You do public participation to plan for emergencies, but not to respond to them. And this was an absolute example of where you could and where it did work. And I think one of the reasons it worked was because it was an emergency, and no one questioned the need for speed. No one questioned that this had to happen, and it had to happen in this kind of beyond unreasonable time frame. And to some degrees, the agencies were accountable. We held them accountable, but what we found was largely we had to do their work for them. In some ways, we became project managers for 30 days. Because no agencies really move that fast. But they did support us, and they did support the process. And we had a champion inside EPA that was willing to pay the bills and make it work, and he did, and that was sort of an unbelievable thing. We never would have been able to do it without him within the EPA. And you really have to make sure that the public understands and works within the real constraints. It's so easy to sit on the sidelines and say no, and in some ways, they're saying no is what kicked this whole thing off. But as soon as they realized it was time to start saying yes to something, and that they had to really be part of the process, they all fell in line really fast, and it didn't take a lot to convince people. They came grudgingly, but ultimately they were convinced we have to work within the real constraints of this situation, and find a way to collaborate and find an answer together. We really put industry on the spot, and the dangling of a multi-million-dollar project, a payoff didn't hurt, but they really stepped up quickly. They were honest. They promoted their technology, certainly, but they also, some of them just said, we really can't do that. We really can't meet that. And for the most part, we found that people were very honest in how they approached that very quick process. While we didn't find the one technical advisor to kind of lead this whole thing, we did have enough technical voices in the community and technical advisors in the community that they did generate the trust, and they didn't have to completely rely on the agencies to be the voice of every technological issue. And finally, we found when people are motivated, they can do the impossible. A lot of people worked really hard, gave unbelievable amounts of hours in a very short period of time, and it's what made it all possible. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll hand it back to our moderators.
Thanks very much, Doug and Kristi. Wow, that was quite the journey that both of you went on. Now, I have some questions in the question box, but I really do encourage everybody else that's online, please send me any questions that you might have. So the first one is from Emily. You talked a little bit earlier on about an open webinar tool or platform that you used where people could see all of the changes online as they were watching. They were just wondering what it was that you used.
Kristi, do you remember the name of the technology? It was something that EPA had access to. It worked. I don't.
Well. It was nothing particularly special. It was EPA, whatever EPA was using at the time.
It wasn't like a platform that you can just buy out there in the public. It's something that they had within their control.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. But if anyone else knows of platforms, certainly, actually, we use GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar a lot, where we can actually be manipulating things on the screen while people are watching. If anybody else on the call knows of different things that you can use, please add them to the question box.
Let me point out just this one thing about that technology. It had no bells and whistles. It was very simple. Where we were taking notes was simply a panel at the bottom of the screen that, we were typing into that panel as it goes. It would be like typing into this chat room here. It wasn't sophisticated, but it did allow us to do what we needed to do.
Thanks, Doug. So another question from Jo. Just apologies if she missed this, but she was wondering who paid to engage your services and other technical advisors as they needed. Like, who is the main point person? I'm amazed that they all threw up their hands and said they weren't going to help you, but there must have been somebody. So just sort of wondering.
It was EPA. So EPA was on the spot for this decision ultimately, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and he paid our bills, and they were able to bring us on board so quickly because we have a standing contract with them.
Oh, excellent.
So ironically, the community selected us kind of based on earlier work we had done, but then the agency paid for it. And the two community, quote, experts that were, we kind of pointed out that were from the state but not from the community. One was a professor and one was an NGO activist that provides technical expertise. They both donated their time. And so, we couldn't get EPA to figure out a way to fund them quickly enough, and they sat through days of the RFP process at volunteer time.
Wow, real excellent. Thank you. So, from Anne, how many people were in the original advisory group, and how were those members selected?
I would say we had about 35, and ironically, the community group, before we had been hired, they had seen what we had done online, and they had selected their own group. And we thought, oh no, that's going to be a disaster because, people kind of select their best friends. We actually looked at it, and based on our timeline and that it wasn't a bad mix of people and diversity, we said, okay, that's good, let's go. And so the community selected it. And they did a pretty good job. We added some local government folks and a few other pieces, but we basically went with what they selected.
Correct. Just a quick follow-up question to that, Kristi. The people that you selected, did you find that they would go out and they'd talk to their neighbors and their friends and bring those thoughts and ideas back into the room as well, or were they just bringing their own personal thoughts into the room?
We were really encouraging the service liaisons to the community. Frankly, the main way they did that was through this Facebook page, though. I mean, this Facebook page was just alive at all times of day and night. I mean, frankly, you could start watching it like TV if you weren't careful and lose hours in the day. But so you could see that, they were bringing along 8,000 folks. And frankly, given the size of the community, that's a huge percentage.
Yeah, this was the biggest deal in town. There weren't too many people who weren't aware of it and weren't connected to it in some way, shape, or form.
Thanks. So from Christina, what were other criteria in your ground rules in addition to the no surprises rule?
They were pretty straightforward, the kind of ground rules that we all kind of put out there. I mean, we put a big focus on civility as we move through that, behavior type ground rules. We also put a ground rule on sort of expediency, saying, let's all agree this is an emergency and we're moving fast and we're not going to spend time on small, petty things. And I think people responded to that well.
Great, thank you. So Jen Colbert has raised her hand. So Jen, I've opened up your mic. If you want to ask your question directly, that would be great.
Oh, thanks, Amelia. So my question is in regards to, you said you talked on the Facebook page of, I guess, this group or the opposition, and my clients are always very hesitant to do that. And I'm wondering, did you use your personal accounts to do that, and kind of like how you navigated that space of social media?
This is Kristi. I just use my personal account, and I know that's kind of goofy, and I'm still friends with a number of the people on Facebook. Of which, has had its own ups and downs, as you might imagine. But, again, we left so many niceties behind in this project, given the timeline, that I think had we had better time, we would have done something different. But, we jump on and say, I'm Kristi, I'm the facilitator for the project. Here's when the next meeting is, and your rumor's wrong about this, and we look forward to seeing you.
Well, thank you.
The other part of this too was, as you can imagine, it was moving so fast. We did not have time to ask for permission. We did not have time to think about better ways. I mean, Kristi and I, we talked several times a day, every day, and it was just, how do we deal with this emergency? How do we deal with this emergency? How do we make this work? Okay, fine, let's do it that way. We just don't have time to work through better ways.
Great. Thank you very much.
In fact, I would love if people kind of think about this. If you have other ideas, because we definitely did the best we could, but I'm sure there's more thoughtful ideas that we didn't come up with in the time frame. I'd love to see any of those notes or ideas when you fill out your review.
Yeah, and I'll certainly encourage people to continue to put things into the question box if you've got any other ideas. Certainly the Facebook is getting a few questions here, but let me go on to Scott's question next. How did the main opponents, the ones identified in the earlier slides, feel about the process at the end?
I think all of them except for one were really thrilled. All except for two, I'd say. And most of them, a number of them have told stories about it and kind of moth-like situations. A number of them have written papers about it. The two that were not happy were the international woman, the woman from California who really was anti-incinerator. And it depends on which definition you use, but some might call this a very fancy incinerator. that they picked. And she had one person locally that really had a hard time giving up the other technology that they had kind of attached to. But generally, the community felt like they had dodged a bullet and were thrilled. Really felt like they, as a community, I mean, it's the best of all worlds. They felt like they, as a community, had come together and solved the problem. I think Doug and I were probably pretty invisible in many ways to them in the way that we should be. I mean, they did it together.
Excellent. Thank you. From Toshtaki, when you used the online webinar, did you feel elderly people could take part in the discussion as well? I guess young people were more used to computers, and just wondering whether or not there was any imbalance with the participants.
You did not have to be online to be in the conversation. You could just call in and be on the phone. Quite a few of our participants on the work group were elderly. There were a lot of retirees in this community, and I don't think we had an instance where someone came and said, I feel like I'm not able to participate.
Excellent, thank you. Elise, I can see your hand up, but we're getting a lot of static through your line. So I know that you've got a question in here. So I'm sorry that I can't open up your line, but we're getting a lot of static. So from Elise, and I think you've largely answered this one, Kristi, but again, the questions about participating and moderating with the Facebook group. That seems to be an ongoing concern. So I think you've probably responded to it, but if there's anything else that you want to add to that, please do.
I don't have anything additional. I think in retrospect we would have set out some guidelines and rules, but we didn't. And that Facebook page, by the way, I looked at yesterday. It's still up and still has over 8,500 people on it. They're on to the next issue in the community. Interesting enough. So it made a community willing to kind of own themselves in an interesting way and take over leadership.
Reflecting on that, and because obviously we've had a lot of other work since then. One of the things that always occurs to me as I work with clients, and I get that kind of, we don't want to be on social media in that way. We don't want to be on these sites. I always tell them, if you let false information just lie there, it becomes truth for that community. And so, engaging in a non-defensive, non-confrontational way, but offering reasoned and truthful information through those vehicles, I think it makes perfect sense. Pointing people to information, helping them. If that is where they're having this conversation, you need to be there.
Yeah, thank you.
Also, the other thing we ended up doing quite a bit was we'd see something, and instead of an outside facilitator weighing in, we would call one of the advisory board participants and say, hey, can you weigh in on that you are a community member and you did get to participate, and here's the issues. And because, as always, you have people bobbing in, midway through the process, and who is the government, and who set this up, and who are these facilitators. So we would often hand over comments and ideas back to the community members and ask them to kind of stop the rumor mongering that would take hold.
Yeah, I love the fact that both you and Doug have talked a lot about ownership. And I know within the P2 realm, it's often not, it certainly wasn't yours and Doug's issue, it was the community's issue. So to give them that opportunity to understand what the issue is and to bring them in to help solve it gives them the ownership, but it also makes them the champion of the program, of the whole process. So it's wonderful to hear both of you using ownership so often. Another quick question from Angie. How did local government, county, and city engage in this process?
Okay, that's kind of a funny question because in Louisiana they have different words for everything. They have parishes, they have judges that are county level folks. I mean, they had more words that Doug and I could not figure out that are just not common in most of the U.S. But on a regular basis, the mayor of 2 or 3 cities was there, certainly the mayor of Shreveport's office and the sheriff, and then a number of parish jurors were involved. So they were very actively involved. But frankly, like everybody, were, not experts in this stuff and going, how the hell did we get here? And, the sheriff going, yeah, I didn't know what happened that night. We had to fly a helicopter up to figure out what went wrong. So they were all very engaged. but not willing to take any ownership.
One of the people that we probably didn't give enough credit to in this whole system was the colonel who was in charge of the Camp Minden base. And he really ultimately became the guy who had to step up to the plate and be a leader in this. I mean, ultimately, it was his problem. I mean, the Army had walked away from this, and so the National Guard base owned this material and had to deal with it. And so he was very good to work with, and he was very proactive in how he helped solve problems.
Well,
He was funny because he was go ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
He was an old-time military guy that had never worked with the public this way and thought the whole thing was goofy at the beginning. And at the end, he ended up delaying his retirement by 6 months to make sure this got done, and loved this public engagement piece. And really, you could see he kind of got religion about that there was a different way to do it than just the command and decide approach that he had used most of his career.
Something that all of us always hope for, someone that was a skeptic to start with and then becomes a champion. Nothing better. That sounds fabulous. So with that, we're actually going to bring your portion to a close, unless there's any last words that you want to say, or any advice or guidance to the participants on the line. Kristi or Doug?
Don't do this at home.
Thanks for your time, folks.
So so before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone, coming up next month is another Denver Encore, so another one from the conference, and it's called Beyond Inclusion. It's a study of an historically mainly white public agency, Metro, the 3 county areas surrounding Portland, Oregon, that decided to develop a racial equity strategy. Patty Unfred and Peggy Morrell from Metro and Emily Lai of the Momentum Alliance will join us. And in fact, since last September, they've made some new findings and developed some new sites, and they're going to share all of that with us Tuesday, June the 12th at the usual time of 11 a.m. Pacific. And of course, we always remind people to sign up through your affiliate website to do that. But on behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia, Doug and Kristi, I just want to say a really big thank you. I love the fact that after a couple of slides, we kept seeing, and it could go off. So we loved the explosion. And so I'm so grateful that it didn't explode. And I'm incredibly impressed with the quick time that you were able to turn it around and get to a conclusion and have that conclusion implemented. And from everything that you've told us, people were pleased as well. So big time congratulations, and many, many thanks for sharing your story with us today on the webinar. Just a reminder to everybody, within the next 24 to 48 hours, you will be receiving something from Drew with today's recording, the PowerPoint, and any other additional materials that Kristi and Doug want to share. And the other thing we always ask is please fill in your survey, because it helps us to continue to improve. So a very big thank you to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Kristi and Doug, thank you. Drew, thank you again for all of your technical support. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye now.